Right, well, thank you for inviting me again. A different venue. I was saying when I came in, I give quite a few talks at the Erasmus Darwin Centre in Lichfield, but this is the first time I've ever been here. Quite impressed. Right now, this particular talk, I do hope it doesn't upset anyone because unfortunately, this area was quite badly affected by what we're talking about in the wrong way completely. Anyway, democracy in action. And what it does, it looks at local elections that took place between 1715 and 1832. But it does actually go a little bit over at the end, as you'll see. And I won't give anything away about that now. Now, the fact of the matter is that we complain about our democracy today, and of course that's quite legitimate. But compared with what it used to be like, our democracy is very, very good. And it does give people a chance, if they want to say what they want to say. Now, the fact of the matter was, in the year 1715, that definitely didn't apply for all the reasons I want to tell you about. And one man who summed it up perfectly is this gentleman, who probably one of the horriblest people who ever lived in many people's eyes. He came from Edinburgh. He was a judge. His real name was Robert McQueen, but he was much better known by his title, and they still can't work out why he chose the second name, Judge Braxfield. And he was actually the subject of a horrible book that was written later by Robert Louis Stevenson called The Weir of Ermiston, where he described him as the greatest villain in history. Anyway, he was a judge, and he was known as the hanging judge because he used to hang prisoners, even if it was quite clear that the evidence wasn't decisive, you know. And he once said, let them bring me prisoners and I will hang them. Not very nice. But the reason why I'm talking about him is because he believed very, very much in the electoral system that existed then. In the year 1715, only 3% of the population in Britain had a vote. We're talking about 214,000 people. And done a bit of research on it, and I happen to know the area around Cannock, and it was mainly fields, but the area around Cannock, there were only 5 people who had a vote. Can you imagine that? Where we are now. It was farmland, you know, but no one had the vote. And he summed it up. He said, government in this country is made up of the landed interest, which alone has the right to be represented. As for the rabble, that's everyone else, who have nothing, what security has the nation for the payment of their taxes? They may pack up and leave the country in the twinkling of an eye. Now, that didn't really happen, but in theory, I suppose it could have done. That was his view of things, that the existing system where only a really small percentage of the population had the vote, that was quite legitimate, because only those people who were landed people, as you see, with a bit of money, only those people had the right to vote, in his opinion. And the sad thing is, many people agreed. Now, in the 1700s, there was one very famous painter, I'm sure you've heard of. He painted lots of incredible paintings. One that he painted became very, very well copied indeed. His name was William Hogarth. And the place he painted was he called it Gin Lane. Did have another title, but he called it Gin Lane in London. And that was because gin had taken over, made from the juniper fruit. Gin had taken over in many parts of the country. People had become completely addicted, and certainly in London. And what he was saying was that the majority of people, a lot of poor people, certainly had no right to vote, but also, you know, they couldn't have understood our modern type democracy anyway, because most of them were drunk most of the time. Gin had taken over. And in that building, it's quite famous, there's a lady who is obviously blind drunk, sitting on the steps near the front, and she's dropped her baby. the baby almost certainly will fall to its death. And she doesn't care. And many of the people behind are drinkers. You can tell that by the expressions on their face. One business that's doing very well indeed, you can perhaps see the silhouette in the background, is the undertaker. There's a lot of people, of course, did die. Didn't have the vote, did die. And Hogarth was showing this. Hogarth was painting it as a painting of despair. It was actually set in a place called St. Giles Parish in London, right, where gin drinking was particularly bad. Now, again, Hogarth kept painting scenes. And one thing he painted, which again is really interesting, is this one. An election meeting in the middle years of the 18th century. Now, this is an election meeting which would take place the evening before the election. And we know, because it was originally in colour, that because of the flag which is being flown, these people, they had a yellow flag, these people were called Whigs. There were two main political parties at the time. One party was called the Whigs, WHIGS. The other party was called the Tories. There are actually Tories watching through the window at the back, watching what's going on. But this is the election meeting. Now, at the meeting, there was never, ever any discussion of policy. There was never, ever any manifesto that was issued. People didn't know what it meant. The election meeting consisted of a feast and a drinking session. And people who were all voters, who they were hoping would vote for them publicly, they could help themselves to as much as possible. And then probably when they were going out, half drunk or even blind drunk, they'd be told, remember who has paid for this meeting that you attended when you vote tomorrow. And that was how many people won the vote. Not by issuing manifestos and saying, we'll do this, we'll do that, we'll do the other, but by treating the voters. Now, the voters, as we've seen, there weren't many of them. And there's a very good reason for that. It's because to vote, you actually had to be earning quite a bit of money. Elections were only held every 7 years, not every 5 years as they are today. And you had to be what was called a 40-shilling freeholder. You had to own property that was bringing in 40 shillings. Now, it doesn't sound much today, even in the old money, but 40 shillings was a vast amount of money. And that's why there was only a small minority of people who had the vote. They were the ones who were being treated in that meeting. They were potential Whig voters. And whoever was paying for it was hoping to get elected the following day. Now, another very, very famous Hogarth painting. Sorry about this, but he's as good as anybody to use. Another very famous Hogarth painting. And that's it there. And that actually shows the vote, the polling, as it was called, taking place. The year is 1755. And what happened? Well, people who were voting had to climb steps and they had to stand on a high point so that everyone could see them. And then there would usually be a judge sitting at a desk who would, this is probably how Judge Braxfield became interested. There would be a judge sitting at a desk and he would ask the people their name, ask them how much they earned a year, and make a note of it. Sometimes, if the opposition objected, they would check to see if it was close to the limit. They would check to see that people really were entitled to vote. But what is very important is the crowd at the back, because almost always the people who were hoping to be elected would pay for a crowd of supporters to stand at the back, and there'd be free drinks available. And these people, of course, would be shouting or cheering, depending on who you were voting for. If you were voting for the man who paid for all the drinks, they'd be cheering you as you voted. And no one would ever allow the judge to interfere if you were voting for the person who'd paid for the drinks. But if you were brave enough to vote the other way, you'd be booed very loudly and then probably beaten up when you climbed down the steps and tried to go back home. That's how it worked. It wasn't really democracy as we know it today. There was no secret ballot. Now, one man who did very, very well out of this, and so did his family, someone with an interesting local connection, as you'll see. That man, George Granville Lewson Gore. Now, at the time, very sad but true, there were Staffordshire only had 8 MPs. 2 MPs who represented the county, and people living in this area who got the vote, the few who got the vote, they would vote in the county elections. But then, as well as that, there were 4 boroughs that could elect 2 members each. The boroughs were Newcastle under Lyme in the north of the county, which I want to talk about very briefly, and then Stafford further down, which again I want to talk about later, and then Lichfield, which I definitely want to talk about later, and Tamworth. They made up the 4 boroughs. And as I say, you got 10 MPs in total, 2 for the county, and then 8 for the 4 borough seats. Now, the reason why I'm talking about this now is because one of the borough seats was Newcastle. And in a corrupt age, Newcastle was particularly corrupt. It became known as a pocket borough, and I'll explain why that was in a moment, right? The other 3 constituencies weren't quite as bad, Stafford, Lichfield and Tamworth, but Newcastle was rotten. Now, the reason why? Well, it nearly always, 90% of the time, when anyone was elected to be a member of Parliament for Newcastle under Lyme, it was either a member of this family or one of the people they wanted to represent them, right? Now, the family, you can see there, George Granville Leveson Gower. That is how it seems to be pronounced. The fact of the matter was, though, they'd altered the pronunciation. Now, what happened? They were based in a place called Trentham, which I bet quite a few of you visited. And where Trentham Gardens is today, they had a massive hall. It's now in ruins, but they had a massive hall. Now, the reason why they were there, originally there was a convent, a Catholic convent, and a church. The church is still there. But what happened? Well, a gentleman called Henry VIII came along. Without going into detail, because that's a separate talk really, Henry VIII changed the religion of England. He got rid of the Catholic Church and he got rid of all the monasteries and all the convents, right? And what happened was he tried to persuade people with money to pay to take over the properties. Now, amazingly, most of the people with the money at the time were not, in the 1500s, were not members of the nobility. They were up-and-coming merchants. And it so happened that there was a gentleman called James Leveson, Leveson, who came from just north of Wolverhampton, not too far away really. And he had earned his living as a wool merchant, and he made a lot of money, and he could afford to buy the property when it came up for sale. And Henry VIII was quite prepared to sell it to him because he wanted the money from it. Well, he had sons, and so did most of the people who came after him. That was one of the benefits, really, of the family. And what happened was the sons nearly always married rich ladies, rich heiresses. Right? They developed a talent for marrying rich heiresses. And what happened then was, sorry about this, ladies, under the very, very sexist laws of the time, if a lady got married, automatically all her possessions went to her husband. So the Leveson family did very well, in particular when Paul Leveson, who was the grandson of the first one, when Paul Leveson married a lady who was called Jane Gower, Gower. And the family then became the Leveson Gowers. But as they became richer and richer, they did what many people were doing at the time in Britain to trick the poor classes. They were changing the pronunciation of their surname. Have you been to a place in Cheshire? I don't know whether you have or not. Doesn't matter if you haven't. But if you've ever been to a place in Cheshire, that's definitely spelt Cholmondeley. You might know what I mean because it's pronounced Chumley. Well, this is what happened with the Leveson Gowers. They altered the pronunciation of their surname to Lucen Gore. Lucen Gore. And that's what I want to use from this point onwards. I hope it doesn't confuse anybody. Anyway, they controlled various political seats. The closest one was Newcastle under Lyme. And they kept putting people forward. And then something awful happened to them in the year 1735. They took their eye off the ball. They put their candidate forward for the election in Newcastle under Lyme. But sadly, the people in Newcastle under Lyme didn't vote for the Lucen Gore candidate. They voted for the other candidate who became one of the MPs. And the Lucen Gores were appalled. How could they let this happen? They didn't want to make speeches or anything like that. All they wanted to do was call a meeting, as where you could drink and eat, as everyone else did the night before the election. So they decided what they would do. They would try to persuade the people of Newcastle to let them control their vote. And this is what happened, amazingly. What they did, the man who was then the chief of the Lucen Gores, who was called George Lucen Gore, he paid money out of his pocket to have a hospital constructed in Newcastle under Lyme. And then in return, he persuaded the council, the corporation in Newcastle under Lyme, to let him have a 99-year lease on 60 cottages. Now, what made that interesting was the 60 cottages were all owned by people called burgesses, who were the voters. They had the vote. Nobody else in Newcastle under Lyme. What it meant was, from that point onwards, he controlled their vote. Because you could guarantee from that point onwards, anyone who voted for the Lucen Gore candidate almost certainly wouldn't have to pay any rent on their property for the next 2 months. Anyone who was brave enough to vote for the other candidate would probably be evicted within a few weeks. That's how it worked. And that's how Newcastle under Lyme came to be known as a pocket borough. No, it was all in the pocket of the Lucen Gore family. And they did very well. And that's where they lived. And of course, they became richer and richer. And I do a separate talk on this. They became richer and richer until eventually, mainly because of all the land in Scotland that they owned, which they'd turned over to sheep farming and got rid of all the people who were living on it, they were probably the wealthiest family in Britain. We know that the king at the time bought a lot of them because they kept lending him money. George III. Anyway, Trentham Hall, that's what it looked like before it fell into ruins and was knocked down as it is today. And that's Newcastle under Lyme as it was at the end of the century when it was a pocket borough. When you got to vote the way the Lucen Gore candidates wanted you to vote. And they could check, of course. They could check because where you voted, and it's still there today, they're very proud of it. Near where there's a big market area there in Newcastle under Lyme, and a big town, an old town hall area, and right alongside it, they've still got the old medieval market cross. And what you had to do to vote, you had to climb onto those steps and then announce who you were voting for. And of course, there'd be a judge nearby who'd be writing down what you said, and a crowd of people. And if you voted for the Lucen Gore candidate, fair enough, as we've said, you wouldn't have to pay any rent for a few weeks, a few months. If you're brave enough to vote for the other candidate, you get booed, probably beaten up, and then evicted. So it was a bit of a threat. But that market cross is still there in one of what were once the 4 constituencies in Staffordshire. Now, another place that became quite important was Lichfield. And Lichfield originally had Tory candidates. Up to the year 1747, it had Tory candidates. And I'll come on to all this a bit later. And many of them were chosen by the Lucen Gores. They were Tories. Very strong Tories, very strong Blues in their opinion, right? Now, what happened? Well, originally, the candidates there were Tories, but then eventually, in 1747, things changed, as you'll see. And the Member of Parliament for Lichfield in the year 1747 was a gentleman who was a Member of Parliament for many years called Thomas Anson. Now, he's really interesting in our county because of where he came from. He came from a place, again, I bet many of you will have been to from time to time, a place called Shugborough. Yeah, know it? Shugborough. Now, what happened? Shugborough at one time was a sort of not a very wealthy place. At one time, there was a village which occupied sort of a third of Shugborough on the other side, on this side of the River Trent, where Shugborough is today, right? That village was known as Great Hayward. But what happened? Thomas Anson, just go back to him for a second. Thomas Anson, he had a brother who was a sailor, a brother who was called Admiral George Anson. And Admiral George Anson became really, really famous in the 1700s because he sailed ships on behalf of the government across the Pacific Ocean. And when he did so, he actually defeated the main enemy, who were the Spanish. And not only defeated the main enemy, he also captured one of their really wealthy ships called the Acapulco Galleon. People still can't work out how that could sail in rough seas. Had so much heavy gold on it. He captured it and he brought the treasure back to Britain. And a lot of it was donated to the King, George II. They actually had to have 27 wagons to transport all the gold from the ship, from his ship, to where it was, well, basically the Tower in London, which is where it was all stored. But they had to have 20, they couldn't get that close in the ship. They had to moor in the River Thames further out and then have these wagons to bring all the wealth in, right? Now, a lot of money. Now, he was allowed to keep a lot of it. And of course, immediately he retired and he moved back to Shugborough. And his brother Thomas was allowed to keep quite a bit of the money. They got so much. He'd done really well. Now, why is that important? Well, it's important because apart from anything else, they immediately kicked out all the villagers and made them cross the river to go to what is Great Hayward today, if any of you know it, on the other side of the river, the other side of the bridge. They made them move over, right? Because they wanted the land. And then they took the land over. And then George Anson passed away soon after. When he passed away, Thomas Anson, who thought a lot of him, decided what he was going to do. He was going to erect monuments in the gardens at Shugborough, commemorating George's famous voyage. And he had monuments like the Tower of the Winds and the Chinese Bridge, because he'd been through China on his ship, George Anson. But then the other one he did, which is still amazes people today, he had a monument built called the Shepherd's Monument with a big inscription underneath. And even today, no one knows what it means. They reckon, people at Shugborough will tell you, they reckon that there are about 5 people a week who come to them saying they've translated the inscription and they know what it means. But no one does. And they suspect it had something to do with George Anson, and it was put there by Thomas Anson, but no one knows what it means, right? It's a copy of a painting by a French painter called Poussin, and then there's the inscription underneath, right? Very, very interesting.